In this video, I want to briefly introduce you to the concept of IRAC. IRAC is a word you probably didn't hear prior to law school, but you're going to become very familiar with IRAC once you start law school and all throughout your law school career. IRAC stands for Issue, Rule, Analysis, and Conclusion, and it represents the basic writing formula that you will use in most, if not all, legal writing. You're going to use IRAC when you're writing your answers to final exams, in your assignments in your legal research and writing class, and you'll also use IRAC on the bar exam. Lawyers even continue to use IRAC as they practice, so this is a skill that will benefit you for years. There are a few variations on IRAC that I want to discuss. As I mentioned, IRAC stands for Issue, Rule, Analysis, and Conclusion. Sometimes professors request that you use some alternate version of IRAC, maybe on the final exams or on your legal research and writing assignments. One variation of IRAC is CRAC, C-R-A-C, which stands for Conclusion, Rule, Analysis, Conclusion. Or you might be asked to use CREAC, which is C-R-E-A-C. CREAC stands for Conclusion, Rule, Explanation, Analysis, Conclusion. These are both just variations of IRAC. So if you can master IRAC, you can easily twist it into these alternate versions if your professor asks you to use one of them instead. To explain IRAC, I want to use a simple fact pattern, and I'll show you what the different pieces of the IRAC would look like. The fact pattern in the handout says, Peggy and Dave were each driving their respective vehicles as they approached an intersection. Both entered the intersection at the same time and a collision occurred. A witness saw that Dave's light was red while Peggy's light was green. Peggy suffered injuries as a result of the collision. If Peggy sues Dave, will she prevail? To answer that last question, will she prevail, we're going to use the IRAC format to fully identify the issues, discuss the law and facts, and then finally answer the ultimate question. To start, you need to first identify the legal issue. The legal issue here is also the claim that Peggy will be bringing against Dave. Notice that the question says, Peggy sues Dave. So if she's suing Dave, she must have some legal cause of action. Here, she's probably going to raise a claim of negligence. So the legal issue will be negligence. The next piece of the IRAC is the R, which stands for rule. So we just identified that the issue is negligence. Now we're going to state the rule for negligence. As a general matter, the elements of negligence are duty, breach, causation, and harm. We'll discuss a more complex version of IRAC and a more detailed version of this rule in just a minute, but as a brief and simplistic version, what we're doing here is just identifying the elements of negligence. In the R section of the IRAC, you want to introduce the rule for the legal issue that you identified in the I section. Third, you want to apply the rule that you just stated to the facts of the case. Now, this is usually the hardest part of IRAC. This is where you really have to turn your thinking cap on and you have to think like a lawyer. You want to make lawyerly arguments here and you want to analyze the facts. You also want to think creatively. As a reminder, the rule is that negligence requires duty, breach, causation, and harm. Here we can see that Dave was driving a car, so he had a duty to act as a reasonably prudent driver. He breached that duty when he ran the red light. Ordinary prudent drivers don't run red lights. Peggy did suffer harm. The facts say that she was injured. And then it does appear that Dave's breach, running the red light, is what caused Peggy's harm. So as you can see, the analysis discusses each piece of the rule, the duty, the breach, the cause, and the harm, and how the rule applies to the facts of this case. So under these facts, we can see that each of these elements is most likely met. The last part of the IRAC is to state the conclusion. So because the elements of negligence are met, we can answer the question of whether Peggy will prevail by writing, therefore, Peggy will likely prevail against Dave in an action for negligence. Now, if this was a law school exam or if this was a legal research and writing assignment, you would probably want to provide a little bit more detail than what we just covered. The section of the handout titled Putting It All Together illustrates an IRAC with slightly more detail than what we just covered. It starts with an issue statement. They tell us that the issue is whether Peggy can establish a claim for negligence. Then it states the rule for negligence. It says, in order to establish a prima facie case for negligence, Peggy will have to show that Dave had a duty, he breached that duty, and that his breach was the cause of her damages. And then this rule statement explains what each element actually means. It says a defendant owes a duty of a reasonably prudent person acting under similar circumstances. Causation requires both actual and proximate cause. Actual cause is also referred to as but-for causation, and it asks, but for the defendant's breach, would the injury still have occurred? If the answer is no, then the defendant is the actual cause of the plaintiff's harm. Proximate cause asks whether the harm was the foreseeable consequence of the defendant's breach. Finally, the plaintiff must show some actual damage to be able to prevail on a negligence claim. So you can see that in addition to just identifying the elements of negligence, this rule statement goes a little bit further, and it provides an explanation of what each element is. Moving into the analysis, it says, in this case, Dave was driving a car, thus he had a duty to act as a reasonably prudent driver. That means that he should have been paying attention when approaching and driving through the intersection. It appears that Dave breached that duty because he was not paying attention as he entered the intersection, thus striking Peggy's car. Dave is the actual cause of Peggy's damage, because had he been paying attention, the collision would not have occurred. He is also the proximate cause, because it is foreseeable that not paying attention while driving can lead to collisions. Finally, Peggy did sustain damages in the accident, therefore she can establish this final element of negligence. And then finally we have the conclusion, which says, therefore, Peggy will prevail against Dave in a claim for negligence. So as you can see, the IRAC, which stands for Issue, Rule, Analysis, Conclusion, is a very formulaic approach to discussing these legal concepts. You identify the issue, state the rule, apply the rule to the facts, and then come to a conclusion. It might feel very rigid and maybe a little unnatural to answer a question like this, but this is actually a great way to approach legal writing. It might not be a type of writing that you're used to or that comes naturally to you, and so remembering the IRAC formula and practicing this approach will make you a better legal writer.